I think we could just, ma'am, we could just give 2 or 3 minutes for people to join in. I think another 1 or 2 minutes, and then we can start. So, ma'am, shall we begin? It's 8:02. Do we give it another minute? Hello, ma'am, am I audible?
I can hear you.
Yes, yes. Okay, you would. I think you were on mute. Very briefly.
Yeah.
Okay. So can we? I think we'll start. All right. So hello and welcome to the Mithila Review Show. I'm your host, Mithila Singh, the managing editor of Mithila Review, the journal of international science fiction and fantasy. The Mithila Review Show is an inclusive platform that hosts writers, editors, publishers, and readers from across the world to expand our conversation about speculative imaginations of past, present, future, and beyond. For the fourth episode of the MR Show, we have with us writer and physicist Vandana Singh. She's a writer of speculative fiction and a professor of physics at a small and lively public university near Boston. She was born and raised in New Delhi and has maintained deep and fruitful entanglements with the Indian context. Her critically acclaimed short stories have been reprinted in numerous best of year anthologies, and her most recent collection, Ambiguity, Machines and Other Stories, published by Small Beer Press and Zuban in 2018, was a finalist of the Philip K. Dick Award. Her stories have won the Parallax Award and the Tiptree Honor, and her first collection, The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet, published by Zuban, New Delhi in 2013, was a finalist for the Grand Prix de l'Imaginaire in the French translation. She has also written 2 children's books in the Young Uncle series. A particle physicist by training, she has been working for a decade on a transdisciplinary justice-based conceptualization of the climate crisis at the nexus of science, pedagogy, and society. Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction.
I'm absolutely honored to have you joining us here today. And I'm sure a lot of us here in the audience are excited for this conversation. I did hear back a lot of people looking forward to this conversation.
Well, I'll try to make it worth their while.
Both are Friday evenings.
Yeah.
So those in the audience who want to ask us questions, please drop them in the chat box here or in the comment section on YouTube. If time permits, I'll take them up at the end of the program. So ma'am, shall we start?
Yes, please.
All right. So, you're a scientist and a writer, like, Vandana Singh, the scientist, Vandana Singh, the writer. So when you sit down to write a story, what negotiations between these two identities, what exchanges between these two identities take place on a daily routine basis when you sit down in front of your laptop to write?
Well, actually, the scientist part of my brain and the writer part of my brain are always talking to each other. And so, even at the unconscious level, even if I'm doing something that's not science or not writing. So it's in a way, it's like what bubbles forth from my unconscious, and each feeds off the other, actually. They don't feel independent, even though science has different constraints than speculative fiction writing does. But nevertheless, they seem to feed off each other. One quick example would be that I was setting up a fairly standard undergraduate physics lab in rotations some years ago. And it occurred to me that classical conservation laws aren't given that much, they're relatively unglamorous compared to, the wow factor of modern physics. So, and it suddenly came to me that what if we had these giant wheels turning in space, and And therefore, a story was born from that, just from musing about that. So yeah, the two always talk to each other. That's true.
So you as a writer, you've learned, I mean, obviously that science informs your writing, but do you think scientists can take away something from speculative fiction or from storytelling as a mode?
Oh, definitely. And in fact, other ways of interacting with the universe, that you may traditionally call the arts and humanities, do feed the scientific imagination. And in fact, most people who've had a negative experience of learning science don't even realize how much imagination it takes to be a scientist. And to ask questions like, Einstein famously did, like, what would happen if I was traveling at the speed of light next to a light beam? Um, so, so I think that that people can learn from, from speculative fiction as well. And sometimes speculative fiction has anticipated things that, like and I'm not 100% sure of this example, but, what happens to black holes in terms of what it does to the human body as it falls towards a black hole actually showed up, if I remember correctly, in a science fiction story. That speculation showed up before physicists confirmed that, what happens is what they call death by spaghettification. So, but I think that in general, that's true. Like whenever you exercise the imagination in whatever way, there's I've heard of a person, a physicist who studies fluid dynamics, who's also a painter. And as he's painting, ideas come to him that inform his research work. So it goes both ways.
Right. So I recently I watched a documentary on black holes, and there was a quote in which, that black holes are always hungry. That's why they want to feed. So for me, it was just like a black hole is akin to a beast, to an animal, to man, just hungry, to consume something. So, and I feel like that kind of translation of scientific metaphor, like, translates into the metaphor of your stories very often. So what started you on this journey of writing speculative fiction? And also, I mean, you're a scientist, so what according to you sets speculative fiction apart from science fiction? Is it just a taxonomical thing that's that's relevant only to publishers, librarians, and booksellers? Where you want to categorize speculative fiction and science fiction, or do you think speculative fiction gives you that kind of freedom to move beyond Newtonian science? Because science fiction somewhere still holds you accountable to it, or is that a very limited understanding of science fiction?
Well, I mean, for me, it's actually quite simple. Speculative fiction is an umbrella term that includes science fiction. It includes fantasy, includes magic realism, includes what you might call science fantasy. So it's sort of like a larger umbrella than what you might consider science fiction. And science fiction is not always limited to Newtonian ways of thinking, but nevertheless, there are some, there are constraints because, your constraints, you might decide that, okay, the science that we know now has to constrain the story, or you might decide that I'm going to extend the science that we know now, in a speculative way. And maybe that's still science fiction, or maybe it's gone into the realm of science fantasy, who knows? I mean, in a way, these are just classifications of convenience. So I try not to take them too seriously. I leave that for the scholars, but it's often helpful to me to talk about speculative fiction because I occasionally, although I mostly write science fiction, I sometimes also write fantasy and things that are in between. So.
Right. So do you as a scientist feel a burden to predict scientific futures, technological futures, or future technologies?
You mean a burden to like
is that a burden
them, or
and of course, yeah, to address them too?
I don't see. You mean as a constraint?
Yeah, as a constraint.
Is that what you mean? Yeah, no, I don't see that as a burden. In fact, constraints can actually be very powerful to the imagination. One example I've heard, for instance, is that look at the musical octave. That's a constraint, and yet it allows you so much creativity. So constraints actually can open up our creativity, and I don't see it as a burden. I see it more like something to play with. Like, and I've had no hesitation in positing universes that are not like ours, like that's the joy of the what if question that's so central to science fiction and speculative fiction, that what if things were different? And so what if the laws of the universe were different? What kind of universe would that be? So there's, one gets to indulge in this sort of playfulness, whether you are taking the constraints seriously, or you're simply messing with Mother Nature and saying, well, Mother Nature, what if it was this way instead of that way? What would you do then? So so it's all fun and I enjoy it.
And what started you on this journey of writing?
Oh, yeah. I don't know, it's a combination of being a kind of shy kid who was probably more comfortable with, outside the known circle of humans. I was more comfortable with street dogs and birds and so on. So I spent a lot of time like curled up on a tree and just watching the world go by, including the non-human world. And I think, and I also read a lot of fantastic stories, including little paperbacks in Hindi, but also some very trashy science fiction, and gradually read more and more sophisticated stuff. And then there were these experiences, like I'll tell you only one of them, where, when we used to visit grandparents in Patna. I'm from Bihar, which is another reason I really like the word Mithila in Mithila Review. But anyway, so on the rooftop, we used to sometimes on fine nights, they used to let us siblings and cousins all put cots there, and we'd sleep under the stars. And this was before pollution was such a big deal in India, before the whole plastic waste problem, all of that. And the stars always used to be vividly clear. And I remember wondering, like, if as I looked up into the stars, whether other beings were looking down at me. And that whole thing of the world being this source of endless wonder that you could explore in the era before we didn't have a TV, for instance. It was like, it just kind of, science fiction was a natural habitat for me since that time. So it was very natural for me to start writing it, although I started writing it seriously only when I came to the US as a graduate student, because that sense of alienation was so strong. Like, where have I landed up? And there was no other literature that seemed to speak to that sense of being far from your home than science fiction. So
right. And since we've been talking about home, what has been the influence of Delhi on your worldview and imagination? What is it about the city that, I feel like Delhi as a city lends itself very well to speculative imagination. And you have based a few stories in Delhi. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I was born and brought up in Delhi, and right into my 20s before leaving. And I always planned to come back, and, circumstances are such that didn't happen, not yet anyway. But, you can take the girl out of Delhi, but you can't take Delhi out of the girl in that sense, right? So, although Delhi is not, if you look at it objectively, it's not a nice city to be in. It's not a very safe city. It's not, and there's a lot of things, especially now, that are more wrong with it than right with it. But when I was growing up, and I wasn't conscious that there was anything particularly fascinating about Delhi. Even though we would do things like, when we lived in a colony in South Delhi, and our milkman, and this was the days just before the automatic milk machines had started, used to live in some crumbling medieval tombs, along with his family and the cows and everyone, And sometimes my brother and I would have to walk across if he didn't show up, with the milk container. And it was somehow I took it all for granted until I left. And then I looked back and thought, oh my God, what a strange juxtaposition of worlds Delhi is. And it was, it occurred to me that, and of course we know from history, the 7 cities of Delhi, and then the Lutyens city, and then all the possible Delhis that live alongside. So it's ancient history, the juxtaposition of modern and ancient, the craziness of it, the massive inequality that you see on a daily basis just by walking from point A to point B, along with the kinds of embodied experiences I had, not just going to school, but as a college student hanging out of a DTC bus, those sort of things. They just like formed who I am in a way. So my story, Delhi, is an inadequate tribute to that formative experience. And of course, I'm always haunted by it. So, yeah.
So in fact, I was reading your story again before the interview, and I recently visited a 13th century monument. It's tucked away, it's very unassuming, and as you said, the milkman living in tombs. So you don't even recognize that these are historical sites. And I figured that this was called Chor Minar, which is the Tower of Thieves. And according to legend, it's the Tower of Beheading. So, where severed heads of thieves were displayed on spears. And there are 225 holes in this particular tower. And that's where, so that, nobody would steal and stuff. So I felt that, that was extremely fascinating to me, because I felt like, I don't know if this tower is out of a speculative fiction, or am I a part of this, am I participating in some story that's part of and I honestly felt I was in a story written by Vandana Singh. It made me think of Delhi accent. That's why I came back to reading the story again and thinking about Nichi Delhi and the verticality of the city also.
Right, yeah.
And since you were talking about trashy science fiction novels, one of your characters also reads trashy science fiction novels in hunger. And in fact, in the end, there is this urgency that you express, that there's an urgency for her to read science fiction, albeit trashy ones, as an endorsement of something that leads to an expansion of social and imaginative empathy. And this is something that is at the core of a lot of your stories, that sense of belonging and, things like that. So do you think that even trashy science fiction, and whatever that is, okay, however you define that, I find it difficult to even define science fiction, let alone something that's trashy. But do you think all science fiction, or even trashy science fiction, is capable of expanding our empathy?
Well, let's talk about what at least I mean by trashy science fiction. There's harmless trashy science fiction, or relatively harmless trashy science fiction, and then there's toxic science fiction, trashy science fiction, which if you consume it, it's not good for you. So let's if we limit ourselves to talking about the harmless trashy science fiction, those would be stories that don't pay attention to constraints very well, where you zip across the galaxy without worrying about or talking about or finding a way around the light speed limitation or whatever, and ridiculous and impossible things happen. Now, the importance of reading that, especially as a child, is that it's through the contrast between that and literary or really deep and imaginative and intelligent science fiction that you learn the difference between poor quality and good quality. But it's also true that that sort of science fiction does expand one's imagination, especially as a child. I used to read these little pocket books in Hindi, which were about, it totally mixed up, science fiction, fantasy, the whole works, there were fairies zipping around on spaceships and whatnot. I have vague memories of that. And it does kind of, in childhood anyway, our categories aren't cemented as yet.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of breaks apart that categorization process that happens as we grow up. And I think that, so in those two ways, like one, helping you recognize quality by contrast, and the other is that really kind of breaking up that categorization process and expanding the mind. That is also a potential of so-called trashy science fiction. It's the way that we can enjoy certain classic masala movies, even though we know that they're ridiculous. Yeah. But like you go with a group of friends and you watch them and it's like a blast, so.
Yeah, I mean, I feel terrible that I can't go back to watching the 90s Bollywood without that awareness. I mean, sometimes I wish I could go back to that lack of awareness and just enjoy things for the sake of even trashy or not trashy.
It's very hard after a point. That's true.
After a point, yes. So, and I think, so this sort of conversation around empathy that science fiction or speculative fiction is meant to cultivate, it's also leading to a lot of conversations about ethics and dealing with machines. And if machines should have rights. And I think every Divya's machine would deal very closely with that. But you take that conversation to another level where you not only expand the need for empathy, but you also redefine our own understanding of life itself. So you expand the definition of life. So in your stories, you often portray life as something that's expansive within animal, plant, rock, and even machine. And for that matter, you attach meaning and life to objects and artifacts. So in tetrahedron, ambiguity machines, shikasta, entanglement, they're all concerned with what makes something alive. Even in Sailing the Tata, you propose that when we begin to recognize alien life, that we can only begin to recognize alien life once we change our understanding of life at an epistemological level. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question. And, for physicists, it's not a surprise that matter is active in the universe. I mean, think of the simple thing as slapping your hand on the table. The table slaps you back, right? So, matter is active in the universe, and that's not surprising. But to think about, well, all right. So what is life? What do we mean by life? Of course, it depends on your definition, and your definition depends on what your socio-cultural context is. And I've always been fascinated by the notion that many indigenous cultures have, that the universe itself is alive. Now, if you look at the biological definition of life, that doesn't work. But I've been fascinated by thinking about, in what sense could you think of the universe itself as alive? And as far as I can go with a physics background, is to think about the fact that matter is active in the universe. And some of the works of Jagdish Chandra Bose that I'm actually starting to dig in, where he has this amazing speculative imagination as a scientist, where, he's talking about the potential, not just of plants being aware. And he's saying this in a speculative way. He's not saying, he's not laying it down as an article of faith. He's wondering about it. And I think that's one of the great things that we miss today in science, that we have this tendency towards scientism, that we limit our imagination. We don't even wonder about the big questions as much. And he's wondering about it. He's even wondering about the aliveness of metals, So it's a constant source of wonder to me. And it's also something that I think is related to empathy and also to relationships, to feeling like you belong to the universe, that everything around you, which I think that teleological sense that was lost in with the advancement of Newtonian science, that you didn't have to think about why things happen or what is the purpose of things happening. It was just the process, the how question that was important. So we kind of lost something, that was what was described as the disenchantment of the world. And so I think that looking at these other perspectives and thinking about what matter means and how matter matters, is really a fascinating exercise for me through those twin lenses of speculative fiction and physics.
So if you were talking about indigenous cultures, so when it comes to speculative fiction, not only do your stories suggest that the speculative fiction should cultivate that sort of empathy, but it also employs it in the very mode of storytelling by filling it, you fill your stories up with all kinds of others. And you previously said that one of the drawbacks of mainstream realist fiction is that it is centered around the human and a very tiny percentage of humans. And your characters are very often drawn from communities that have been historically marginalized. Alongside, there's also a conversation around own stories and own voices that's at the moment happening in the community. How do you maneuver this role of the storyteller?
Well, there's a narrow space between erasure and appropriation. And I try to walk in that space because, let's say that if I say, okay, I'm only going to talk about people like me, then I'm throwing away the entire potential and the point of speculative fiction. Because one of the things that speculative fiction can do well, although it doesn't always, is that it puts you, the writer and the reader, however imperfectly, in somebody else's shoes. And so it expands, it has the potential at least to expand our empathic reach. So that's part of it. And I really think that we should feel free to write about whatever it is that strikes us. But we have to be cautious, and we have to do it the right way. And we have to always be cognizant of where our place is in the power pyramid, And so, for example, a writer, until recently, well, until maybe a decade or 15 years or so, maybe 20 years ago, a writer from the UK or America writing about India would get much more press than an Indian writer writing about India, right? And so that one has to recognize that where you are in the power pyramid, and that your writing may have disproportionate power if you have some kind of privilege. And of course, what you have to do, you have to try to really get the details right, do your research, and talk to people from those communities to make sure you've got the facts right, make sure you compensate them for their time if that's appropriate, depending on your relationship with them, and all of those things. But at the same time, you have to be cognizant of the power aspect. The other aspect is that own voices are really, really important. There's absolutely no substitute for somebody writing from that insider experience of being marginalized. And in fact, if one has to read one or the other, I would say read the own voices. Read people from those experiences. In fact, one of the great joys of living in this time, in this era, and I'm so glad I've lived to see this, is seeing so many writers who are Adivasi and Dalit writers, their works coming into the mainstream, so that we can also be influenced by them. And it's a great joy. So, this is something that narrow space is a very uncomfortable space, especially if you have some kind of relative privilege. So I do this work very carefully. Like, I never write from the inside, like even if my character is indigenous or whatever the group is, I never write from that insider perspective. Usually it's a character who has, for some reason, been separated from their community and is rediscovering it. And usually that character is a scientist, because I know scientists, I can write scientists, no matter what their background, but their background, of course, must inform how they see the world. So I never write from that insider perspective. But the other thing I also do, because I've agonized over this question quite a bit, and I've actually written something for Mithila Review on this, which I think you guys are going to be working with. But what I've tried to think about it is this, that if writers who are kind of more privileged don't write about marginalized people, we are erasing their existence, their struggles, all of that. And yet, if we do write, and we write inappropriately, then we are kind of, exerting disproportionate power in the wrong way and doing more harm than good. So, but what I've decided that the way for me personally is that this narrow space between erasure and appropriation, the way I walk it, is that whatever relative privilege I might have, in my small way, I will use it to let my writings be a conduit to those other writers if they're less well-known than I am. So, for example, I have quoted, I will quote, especially if it's a living writer, I will, with their permission, quote a piece of poetry from that writer and name them in the story. And I've done that a few times. And similar, and my purpose in writing the essay was also to bring out those voices and to say, hey, look at all these people writing incredible works of fiction or poetry, read them. So I feel like that's something that I have an obligation to do, and I take a lot of pleasure in doing it.
I mean, at this point, I'm thinking about, and it just never struck me about these characters as outsiders who are, discovering their culture or who are learning about their culture, because I'm thinking about Shikasta, and in this Annie, Kranti, and Chirag, all three of them are somewhere apart and yet we come and and so their stories are told from that outsider perspective. And I didn't think about that. So thank you for that insight. And you also took in that story, you took Rohit Vemula to the stars. So that was, I think, extremely amazing. And what was also very humbling for me as a reader was also when in the acknowledgement you mentioned having this discussion and having been in conversation with Raja Vemula. So it's not coming from a place of just some absolute like authority over your subject matter, but also in conversation with so many. That also making me think about your you use this concept and the practice of radical kinship in your stories very often. In Sailing the Antarctica or even in Shikasta, when they immerse, like this kind of immersion into this alternate state, or this kind of radical kinship with the tree in like the Devtaru. How do you how does this concept of the radical kinship one become relevant to you? And also I feel because it's also part of so you always talk about the complex system in science, but you also you employ that complex system or that idea of complex systems and patterns and networks within social structure. So how does radical kinship for you play out in that context?
Radical kinship is a really interesting concept, and I'm sure there are multiple definitions of it, but I'll try to give you an idea of why and how that became important to me and what it feels like for me. So part of why it became important is the contrast between how relationships work, or used to work at least, and still do to a large extent in India, as opposed to the US. Now, I'm kind of committing the sin of overgeneralizing just a little bit. We know that there are exceptions and nuances and all that. But in general, the sense of privacy that people have in the US, this very clear sense of personal space and boundaries around social interactions, make it a very different environment. You're always asking permission, even of your friends, can I do this? Can I come? Can I do that? Or whatever. Whereas in India, it's not like that at all, right? I mean, people's lives are totally intertwined, and people take responsibility for each other. The other thing is that in the US, I think convenience is a big deal. So if something is not convenient, people won't do it unless it's an emergency, and then they'll be right there for you if necessary. So whereas in India, I've had a friend go through Delhi traffic for 2 hours to meet me for half an hour, when I was visiting, and that's just normal. So it really made me think about relationships. And the other thing that made me think about relationships is also that I've always felt a kinship with other species. The term biophilia, that we all have this innate tendency to feel connected to other life forms. And then so-called civilization beats it out of you after you grow up, right? So, but for me, it's never been beaten out of me. So, and living in the tropics and subtropics in Delhi, like for instance, there's so many species as you're growing up. There's the myna shrieking at the window every morning, and the dogs barking in the road outside, and all of that. So I, and as a shy kid, I had this sense of kinship with all these creatures. And when you come to temperate regions, there's really not that much, animal life around you. And so I felt what later was articulated by the indigenous ecologist and writer Robin Kimmerer, where she talked about how modern industrialized humans have species loneliness. So I really felt that. I felt this whole species loneliness thing. And I felt the strangeness of trying to negotiate friendship relationships in a very different culture, which had very different, ideas of what that meant. And that really made me think about what is it that, how is it that we are related to each other, and yet we have all these distances between us. So I started to think about how relationships manifest and how they are different in different places, and also our broken relationships with other species, with the rest of nature, and through social exclusion with other humans, and so it's become something that is really important to me to try to figure out what all of this is. And recently I read a paper by an indigenous scholar called Kyle White, where he talks about time as kinship. And it's an absolutely fascinating paper. And it really kind of helped me concretize these ideas. So my next few stories are definitely going to be influenced by that, where he talks about how indigenous Native Americans have conceived of the climate crisis very differently from the linear time concept, where we look at climate histories, we look at climate in the deep past, we look at what's happening in the present, we see the carbon dioxide levels shooting up, and we say, oh my God, what's going to happen next, and that's important. We need to know all those things. But he says there's an alternative, which in my opinion can be a complementary and a corrective to that discourse, where he says, he quotes various Native American storytellers who tell the story of climate as a story of changing kinship relationships. Because in many indigenous cultures, you're not just kin biologically to your family members, but you're kin to everything. And the story of changing and broken kinship relationships, your place of action, your context of action immediately changes when you think about climate change as a story of broken relationships. Because your first instinct is then to look around and see, well, how do we mend those relationships? Whereas on the other timeline, you're consumed by fear. Oh my God, this is going to happen, then that is going to happen. And when we are consumed by fear, we don't think clearly, and we let power co-opt our fear, and we let the strong men come and save us. And also we go on to technological solutions. Oh my gosh, we got to get the carbon down from the atmosphere. And of course, all that is necessary, but that's not the right context for action. And so this notion of radical kinship is really, really important, not just personally to me, but I think in the way that we negotiate the world and the troubles of the world.
I look forward to reading what you're writing next. And that's so amazing, because in your stories, you never seem to suggest that it's science and technology that's going to lead to a paradigm shift. It's very often community, connection, network, kinship that leads to that paradigmatic shift in thinking, in life and living, etc. So I mean, that just makes so much more sense now. And since you were talking about alienness in the sense of not belonging, or that that broken relationship, very often in your stories, because I think for this reason, then that very often the alien is not human. In fact, it's the human is alienated from itself and from others, and that's why it's the human who becomes the alien. And for that reason, your writing is as much about the self as it is about the world beneath and the world beyond. So so the self becomes this site of multiple worlds and realities in your stories. What does this alien being, this human, mean to you? When it becomes the protagonist of your story, or this alien, this other. I'm thinking about Lifeport, for example. And how do you view that alienness or that alienation vis-a-vis your diasporic location?
I think that at one fundamental level, we don't even know ourselves, right? I mean, haven't we all at some point been surprised by our own reaction to something, right? Like, why did I, lash out at that person? Or why am I feeling so sad or happy or whatever, right? So to me, a lot of my stories are about discovery. And even if they are about discovering something to do with outer space, it's also the inner space that matters, because our unconscious, and I'm thinking of an essay by Ursula Le Guin, where she invokes Carl Jung and talks about how the language of the unconscious is symbol and metaphor. So our unconscious, if that's true, the unconscious speaks a different language and is absorbing from the world different kinds of meaning. And whatever bubbles up into the conscious mind sometimes can really surprise us. Because this conscious mind, the metaphor I think of is the surface of the ocean. You can have the surface being there can be waves and storm surges and all of that, but then there are also these deep ocean currents underneath. So I think that because there's, I don't want to think of it as an individual level. That's a typically Western fallacy, because who we are also depends on our context, right? I mean, we can be different in different circumstances. A person who is pretty easygoing, who finds himself or herself in a mob and gets caught up by those emotions and currents and so on, can find themselves committing violence, perhaps, that they would never have imagined otherwise. So how does the context draw out threads that are buried in our unconscious and make us act in some way, or other? So, in a sense, our own mental universe is as mysterious as the universe at large. And it's at least as vast as that if we grow our imaginations. So I think part of the joy of writing speculative fiction is to explore both inner space and outer space.
That's so amazing because in your stories, even when you have a single protagonist, you don't actually have a single protagonist very often in your stories. And even when you have that narrative of a single protagonist, it's entangled with so many other protagonist stories. And I'm thinking of entanglement here. They're always like coming together. So there is no individual per se, as you're talking about, and all these stories are actually entangled in one sense or another. Even if it's not multiple characters, or at least it'll be their former selves, their childhood, all of these sort of come together. And in I think ruminations in an alien tongue, you write, I am myself and yet not so. I contain multitudes and a part of something larger. And that took me back to what you said, like, we don't know ourselves. But you also do another thing, in very often in characters, like, describing distance between people in light years or things like that. So the characters write, you write that, I contain multitudes and I'm part of something larger. I'm a cell the size of a planet swimming in the void of the night. How do you contain this sort of shift from the minuscule to the vast, like, especially when you sit down to write? Like, as a writer, how do you contain that? How do you traverse these multitudes in the span of a single short story?
Well, it's very natural to me, actually. And that's partly my physics education, because the universe exists just as much, in the kitchen or, in one's drawing room, as much as it exists out in the Andromeda galaxy. And I've gotten habituated to that kind of extension, even under the most mundane circumstances. Like, for instance, I don't know if you can see these sunflowers here that a friend brought to me yesterday. And I was admiring their beauty. And immediately I started thinking about planets that orbit more than 2 stars. So far we've discovered planets that orbit 3 star systems, 3 suns. So it's like I kind of jumped in space and possibly, and of course time, because the two are related, just by looking at these sunflowers. But also, if you get conscious of the fact that we have weight at this moment, and that gravity tethers us to the Earth and tethers the Earth to the sun and the sun to the Milky Way and all of that, just for a moment, or, if I'm lifting a heavy pot while cooking or something like that, then I'm thinking about gravity, and then suddenly I'm thinking about black holes, So I think it's very natural. I mean, that's just the way I go through life. And yeah, so it's a great way to be, because I'm not trapped by domesticity, as is very common for middle and upper class women particularly, but generally women in general. But in one way, it's a way of kind of freeing yourself from those walls by recognizing that the universe is here too, right here. So yeah.
So black holes again, back to black holes and hunger and food and consumption. And it's 8:45, so I'm obviously thinking about food. There's a lot of food in your story. And I was doing this thing that when I just went through each and every story. So if there is no food or eating, the process of eating, there's at least fungi in your story. So there is some process of breaking down nutrition. And it's something so central to your stories. You've explored more overtly how communication has become a standard for understanding if anything is alive. So can you say the same thing about eating, like eating as something that not only knows that something is alive, but also that something that wants to live, that has a consciousness?
Well, I never realized that, but you're right, that a lot of my stories have eating in them. And that's partly because, I like eating, but I don't like cooking very much. And I miss other people cooking for me. And so that's probably, the more superficial reason why it shows up. But I think it's because, we eat things that are alive, right? So living things are always reconstituting each other. And in fact, there's this beautiful coincidence that, when you breathe out, every exhalation is approximately about 1 liter of air and contains roughly 10 to the power 22 atoms. And by a strange coincidence, the atmosphere has 10 to the power 22 liters of air, roughly. So, and the atmosphere mixes thoroughly between 1 and 3 years. So, in other words, every atom in your exhalation, one atom from your body is in every liter of air in the atmosphere. So it's not just through eating, but also simply through the act of breathing that we're reconstituting each other. If you look at what happens to the carbon atom that may have been part of a molecule in my cell and is coming out as carbon dioxide, and maybe ends up somewhere in an ocean and then goes through various journeys and ends up in the body of someone else somewhere else. In fact, because of this, we are actually constituted from all the life forms that have existed at least through the last few geological eras. And although that's really bad news for the purists, who want to be pure in race or pure in caste or whatever the hell they want to be pure in. I mean, that's not even possible if you breathe, I think it's a delightful thing that we are always reconstituting each other, that nature seems to have this principle of recycling matter all the time. And so, of course, when we eat, we are doing the same thing. So the thing is, with eating in particular, hunger is also a metaphor, or can be extended to one. And speculative fiction has this lovely relationship with metaphor, where metaphor can be simultaneously, if you want, literal and metaphorical. So hence you can talk about black holes, and you can read it as a story about black holes, but you can also read it as a story of, like if you have a black hole in a binary star system with an ordinary star and it's pulling matter off the star, you can read that as a metaphor for a bad relationship, or wherever your imagination takes you. Yeah. So.
And in fact, that there's also that shift in your stories. Then, I mean, again back to food, but in your first collection, The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet, and other stories, consumption, hunger, thirst, they're all associated with desires and longing, and very often female desire in a middle class setting. But in your second collection, Ubiquity, Machines, and Other Stories, the question of hunger and consumption becomes a little bit more complex. This time around, it's associated with greed or self-knowledge or eating the other, consuming the other. Either way, it comes from a place of lack. Is that a deliberate shift or some?
Yeah, yes, to some extent, because, as I study the climate crisis, as I study global heating and all of those things, the underlying paradigm of modern industrial society is overconsumption, is this notion of endless growth. And recently, a friend who's a climate physicist, Chirag Thara, and I have an opinion piece out in Scientific American about the impossibility of, or the delusion of infinite growth, where there is no sufficiency in that model. There is no satiation. You never feel full. So that endless hunger. I mean, the kind of lack there and I think about, this is my non-expert view of addiction, because really it is, I think, a pathological problem where you're not fed what you actually need, right? So let's say that you need lots of green vegetables and, dal and all those good things, right? But you're only eating chips and candy. And in one sense, your body wants the other stuff, but because it's not getting it, you're eating and it's not satisfying you, because that's not what you need. You need something else. You need the real food, right? So in that sense, I think in our consumerist, globalized cultures, we are fed things that we don't need to the extent that we think we do. And we are therefore never satiated. And so we have this endless hunger that maybe, oh, this thing, well, it makes me feel happy for now, but tomorrow I'm going to be unhappy, so I have to keep eating. And of course, the people who drive it at the apex of the societal power pyramid are the ones benefiting from this literal pyramid scheme, right? So, I mean, there, the idea of hunger becomes this uncontrollable urge to devour and to self-destruct and to destroy everything around you. And in fact, there's a story that I'm hoping will be part of an anthology in India. It's called Widom. And it's about, well, the word Widom is a neologism that comes from WDWM, which is the world destroying world machine. And that's basically modern industrial civilization. And that notion of that endless, unsatisfied hunger, in fact, even in Native American cultures and probably other indigenous cultures too, there's this notion of a monster that can never be satisfied. And if you're a fan of the Japanese master anime maker Hayao Miyazaki, if anyone's seen Spirited Away, there's a monster called No Face that just cannot stop eating. So that's our fundamental problem.
Right. Another person who's a lot about food and eating. Such a lot of his films are about food and eating.
Right. Right.
In your collection, in the two collections, there's another shift that's happening. In the Planet Store collection, most of the characters are either based in India or they're Indian characters. The Ambiguity collection is more global, rather intergalactic, in fact, in its setting, with characters that are both human and non-human. How do you view this shift? I mean, is this you locating yourself in a more global setting as a writer of spec or? Oh.
Well, it's partly that, in the sense that I'm always entangled with the Indian context. I'm hoping to do and have been doing research projects based there, and have deep connections, of various kinds. And maybe I'll be lucky and get to go back for longer periods. I spent 6 months last year in India, and that was just so wonderful. I did not want to leave. So that's part of it, that looking back from a far shore and thinking about what it meant to grow up, what are relationships like, what is the Indian context like, and it's always shifting, always changing, of course, and that's part of it. And then going out into the world and exploring the world at large, and thinking about researching Mongolian history for one story, and the colonial history of the country of Mali in Africa for another story, which is mind expanding. But one always goes home. So, at least I feel like you have to quote Ursula Le Guin again, true journey is return. So I'll always be going back to the Indian context, and understanding it, and writing about it. So I would view it, instead of a kind of straight line shift, that it's simply a kind of spiraling, from the Indian context to the wider and back to the Indian context, and so on, always changing, always spiraling.
Yeah, multiple kinship.
Yeah, something like that.
So, we have just 5 minutes left. So I have just a few quick questions. What excites you about contemporary speculative fiction?
Okay, so well, I think the most exciting thing is the number of diverse voices that we now see. I know that there's a long history of science fiction in the Indian context in many languages. And in fact, I read, I try to keep up. It's always very difficult with the kind of life I have. But in the Anglophone context, one of the most exciting things for me is that even like 10, 15 years ago, I could name the Indian speculative, I could count the number of Indian science fiction and spec fic writers on the fingers of one hand that I knew about. And now there's so many that I can't keep track. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's really wonderful. And then also, in the US context, we have so many more voices of African-American writers and Caribbean-American writers and so on, really enriching the field. So I think that's really exciting.
I think I was at a talk when you were in India. I was at one of these, at the launch of Ambiguity Machines. And that's when I was first introduced to the works of N.K. Jemisin, because you talked about her in that particular conversation. So thank you for that, because I thoroughly enjoyed the series. What are you reading? What are you reading right now?
Well, mostly at the moment, mostly academic papers, but I'm about to start reading The Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And always my bedside reading is Premchand, short stories of Premchand. I think it's very, very important to keep in touch to the extent you can with what's happening in your particular language as well. And Premchand's always been a pretty massive influence, but I keep track and I keep in touch with Hindi through reading a couple of short stories before bed. So
you read that in the original?
Yeah. This is I think it's a like 12 or 14 volume collection of his short stories, which usually I only have time for short stories.
Okay.
These days. So so it's a really wonderful series of volumes that I've had for like 20 plus years, which is why they're falling apart. But they keep me anchored.
Oh, your essential reading is Premchand.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So how has your understanding of speculative fiction changed since you last wrote the Speculative Manifesto? I mean, given a chance, what's that one edit or addition that you'd like to make to it now, almost 10 years later?
I think I would add a few things. The one that's coming immediately to mind is the co-optation of, the way that right-wing elements around the world are coming up with these alternative realities, and which I find very disturbing. That's a misuse of the imagination and of, in order to limit and constrain, it's a constraining of the imagination rather than an expansion. And so, you can, fiction is good fiction anyway, is a way of making counterfactual structures to tell some deep truth. You make up things to tell some kind of a deep truth. Whereas, what we have now is like lies, and more lies. So there's a difference between lying and writing fiction. And that fiction, that difference has been obscured in recent times because of the preponderance of these other narratives that are not meant to be fiction, but are meant to constrain the imagination. They're meant to serve a political purpose. They're meant to disenfranchise and other human beings. And I think that I would talk about that. And then I would add something about why we need the imagination for climate change, for looking at these massive social environmental problems like biodiversity loss, climate change, all of these things.
Since you were talking about, this kind of limitation of the imagination, today in India and elsewhere, we also see an attempt at rewriting history, which suits certain fundamentalist, ethnocentric, ideological positions. And in that context, it obviously becomes more complex to write in the genre of alternative history. I, for one, I had this idea, and then I was just like, ridden with ethical, the possibilities of it taken in all sorts of ways. And you've done that obviously you've done that in a handful of rights, but also with Fate Inspire in Delhi, you have these characters who feel that they not only have the capacity to change the future, but they also have the capacity to change the past. So this idea about characters, people having this capacity to change the past, or this, this delving into alternate history, how do you maneuver that?
Well, in Fate Conspire, it's not about changing the past so much as having certain certain ignored strands of the past actually informing the future, like the voice of Rasundari. Rasundari Devi really existed. She really, wrote those things. But having her as an influence in the future. So thinking about time as having thickness, not just being an infinitesimally thin line that stretches from the past through the present to the future. A Handful of Rice is my only alternative history story. And it was written long before the current era of, people have always tried to rewrite history. But what's happening now is beyond, is like, so, and I'm very cognizant of the danger. And in fact, I'm much more uncomfortable. I've never written any other alternate history. And that's one reason why. Because in the current context, it's actually, so there's danger in, so, when I imagine writing an alternative science, for example, a universe that runs on other rules, then it's less likely to actually do harm to human beings, right? But if I imagine an alternate history that plays into the hands, which I did not do in A Handful of Rice, because it talks about a very syncretic culture that had actually existed in India. So there is some historical context to it. But that story also was a way of kind of freeing myself from the stranglehold of British colonialism, in a sense. But what I've realized since then is that this is not the time for me anyway to write alternative history. And I don't think, and I've always felt uncomfortable doing it. So I think it's important to stay with that discomfort. Maybe there'll be a time when it makes sense. And it's very clear in the story, at least I hope it is, that, because I introduce all these speculative elements as well, that this is not a literal history, so yeah, it's a difficult difficult territory to negotiate.
And because I see it's almost time. So lastly, this is the last question. Do you believe in dead gyms? And if you could, for your audience, elaborate what dead gyms are.
Well, it's a sort of joke in a story I wrote called Peripateia, which are, and basically they represent people. Dead gyms are people, it comes from a Star Trek context, but these are people who've seen through the delusions of the world. And I don't mean that in a philosophical sense, but in a sense of, this has to do with the standard model of particle physics, which is incomplete and has its problems, although it also has, great advantages. And, but the thing is that some physicists even refer to it as a substandard model because it's so incomplete. But the way I imagined it was that, well, there are these aliens who are always constructing the universe, but they're not very imaginative. So they eavesdrop on our physics to get ideas from us. And they, and so, there should be a Higgs boson. All right, let's rearrange things so that there is really a Higgs boson. Things like, so it was just my way of like having this long extended joke about particle physics. And the dead gyms are the people who see through the incompleteness and the shoddy structure of the universe and realize that the aliens are manipulating this stuff. So yeah, so I don't know. I mean, sometimes I feel like a dead gym and sometimes I don't.
I think that's all the time. It's 9:04 and that's all the time we have today for questions. And even though I can't take up audience questions, and I don't think it's the end of our curiosity about your writing and about you as a person, but that's certainly the end of our questions for today. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And thank you again so much for joining us on behalf of our team and all our listeners today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry that the question time is not possible because that's actually my favorite time to engage with the audience. So please forgive me for that as I have to run to another meeting. But it's been a joy and a pleasure and an honor to spend this time with you and with everyone. So thank you. And until next time.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
All right.
So
Take care.
this brings us to a close of the fourth episode of the MR show, and it's time for some plugins. If you enjoyed this episode, please sign up for our newsletter. You can also subscribe and support Mithila Review via Gumroad or Patreon. You're also welcome to join our Facebook community, Asian Science Fiction and Fantasy. I'll post the link in the chat box. Thank you for becoming a part of this conversation. See you all next time.